Hello and welcome. This video is designed to provide an introduction to our unit on the biological basis of human behavior. And so our first step will really be to look at the human brain. Let's just revisit that the theme for this unit, the big overarching concept that you want to be thinking about and applying to various knowledge that we gain in this unit, is that our biology influences our behavior, but then in turn our behavior influences our biology. So we want to understand that interplay between the behaviors that we choose to do and how that might change and alter our biology, but also the fact that we are based with some biological predispositions and developments, and that those developments influence the way in which we behave as a starting point. Okay, so our first task here will be to talk about the brain itself. Actually, we'll start there, and then we'll get down to the cell level and talk about neurons and neural communication. But let's start with the brain. Sometimes it's interesting to talk about it in terms of its evolution over eons, from various animal types to the current human brain that, of course, is the one that we're most interested in. So as you can see in this diagram, the sort of orange, pink, reddish structures here are considered parts of the reptilian brain. And so reptiles, of course, evolved before mammals. That is the part of the brain that humans have that we share with reptiles. And so it's going to control some basic functions like voluntary movement, heartbeat, breathing, things like that, some really basic functions, sleep and so forth and so on. The real change for the brain, the real game changer for the brain, developed with the evolution of mammals. And so one of the important distinguishing characteristics of what's known as the mammalian brain is the addition of the limbic system, which is in this slide shaded green. The limbic system, as we'll learn about in a few more minutes, is going to allow for a much greater capacity for memory, a memory indexing center. It's going to provide for the greater ability for the animal to now regulate internal conditions such as temperature, and it's also going to be responsible for basic drives like hunger and thirst. Sitting on top of the limbic system, you see the purple neocortex. Now, all mammals will have a cortex and a cerebrum, but it will be of much smaller size. What's distinctive of the human brain, which is really the third largest stage of evolution that we need to discuss, is this massive neocortex that you see here. And that's really the difference between the human brain and the brain of other mammals and of other primates, is just its sheer size. Another way of thinking about the organization of the brain and the divisions of the brain is to divide the brain between what's considered the hindbrain, or the lowest structures of the brain, which are here diagrammed in red. The midbrain, which begins to be noticed and developed from the earliest of times, but it is really today seen no longer as necessarily the pinnacle of brain evolution, but really now simply a crossover to the much more sophisticated brain of other mammals and humans. And then the forebrain, as you can see here, which is making up both the limbic system, as we previously discussed, that's the key development for the mammalian brain, shared with humans and mammals. And then, of course, the cerebral cortex, which we already said is this really important evolutionary development for humans, which is really what makes us such a special creature in terms of our ability to learn and make plans and have consciousness, and to be able to consider theoretical ideas and concepts. Okay, so with that said, the first task really is for us to get the anatomy of the brain. And so for that, you should have printed out from the websites some documents, some diagrams, I should really say. They are PDF documents of these slides. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start from the bottom of the brain. We're going to start in the hindbrain. We're going to start with the reptilian brain from an evolutionary perspective. And we're going to slowly but surely get comfortable with where these different brain structures are in relationship to one another. Now, one key thing I want to start off with is just helping you to understand that there is a basic concept to brain anatomy and where things are located and their overall importance to the human brain. So, for example, if we start at the brain stem, at the very bottom of the brain, at the lowest parts of the brain, and we work our way up and to the outside of our heads, the parts at the center and bottom of the brain are really going to be the most primitive. They're going to have the most basic functions. And as you start to move away from the center of the brain and the bottom of the brain and start to move towards the upper outer areas of our brain, sort of the parts of our brain, I guess, that would be closest to our skull, that's going to be where the most sophisticated functions of the brain exist, and that's going to be where the newest evolutionary developments of the brain exist. As I'm hearing my own inner voice, thinking about what I want to include in the slide, as you hear your inner voice, that voice is probably coming from the neocortex. That voice is really part of your consciousness and your most individualistically programmed parts of your brain are really going to be coming from that outer edge, sort of the peel of the brain, if you will. So now we need to understand where these different parts are located. Let's start at the very bottom, again with the most basic structures. And if you feel at the base of your neck, you'll obviously be able to feel the little bump at the back of your neck, and that's really the very top of the brainstem. So we're going to label the brainstem, and we're going to place it right where it should be located, which is the second line up here from the bottom. Right? The brainstem is just simply the top of the spinal cord, and it's here that we have this great bundle of neurons and neural fibers that are coming up from the body through the various neural pathways that help us move our legs and our arms and our other muscle groups, and that are connected to our internal organs, and all of them ultimately are networked through the spinal cord and then eventually come up to the brainstem. And so if we were to sort of draw this in, again, it wouldn't be anything that would be particularly exciting. We don't have to be super precise here, but it essentially would be sort of in this region here. I should probably have like a thicker pen. There we go. See, is that any easier? Yeah, it's a little bit better. I'm actually going to go even thicker with my pen. Your pen may not be this thick, but that's okay. There we go. That's better. All right, so you can see it now in the cross section and on the three-dimensional image here. Okay, with the brainstem labeled, let's move on to the next part of the brain that we want to make sure that we know about, and that is going to be the medulla. The medulla, sometimes called the medulla oblongata, is the next line up on the diagram. And it has another important basic function. It's just right about in this area here. And you can show it on this slide here as well. It's essentially a little bit of that bump that starts to come out just above, let's see if I can draw a little bit better. Oh, there we go. Just above the brainstem. The medulla is in charge of heartbeat and breathing. So again, basic life function, bottom of the brain. And as we proceed up, it should get more complex, and as we move away from the center of the head, it will also get more complex. Okay, the next part of the brainstem that we want to label is the reticular formation. And the reticular formation is a little hard to diagram, but essentially it is a bundle of neurons that come up from the spinal cord up through the brainstem. Your diagram should label it right about here. Oops, it's a little hard to do. But it's a little hard to show in relationship to the medulla and brainstem because it really is, again, this three-dimensional problem that we have. It really is coming up through the brainstem. It's at the center. And basically, it's bringing a lot of information from the body to the brain, to the center of the brain, where it's then going to be distributed. Its main function is to help send messages about general arousal and alertness. So it can be a really important basic function of muscle tension and overall awareness of what's going on around us. And so it's really important for concentration, and it's really important for alertness. Now the next part of the brain that we're going to label is going to sit atop all of these other structures, again, almost in the dead center of the brain. And this is really going to be the thalamus. The thalamus is essentially this almost egg-like part of the brain right here in the center of your head. I'll try to fill it in here. Its main job is to take all this information coming from those lower structures, coming from the brainstem, and essentially relay them to the rest of the brain. So essentially, the way it's usually described is it's sort of the central switchboard of the brain. It's kind of the grand central station. You go there just to find out where to go next, so to speak. So information coming up from the brainstem and the medulla and the reticular activating system or the reticular formation, all of that information is brought to the thalamus and then redistributed to the various parts of the brain that need to be aware of that information. Now we want to label this cauliflower looking object in the back of our brain, sort of tucked back behind the brainstem underneath the larger human brain. And we're going to label that this cerebellum, right? And I sometimes in class I joke around, I kind of sing it a little bit. Cerebellum, right? Because it literally means little brain. And I try to say it with a high pitch so I sound like I'm singing it because it is kind of a bell. And actually, this is part of the old reptilian brain. Let's see, over here it's going to be, yeah, this underneath part here. Again, hard to label with my finger on my iPad, but I think you get a sense as to where this is. Probably a little bit better on the cross section. This is part of the old reptilian brain, and of course we as mammals have evolved the mammalian brain and still share this part. The cerebellum is the part of the brain that controls voluntary function. So again, if someone was to sort of somehow sneak up behind you and punch you in the back of the head or something and there was severe damage to the cerebellum, you'd have a really difficult time coordinating your movement, and so your movement would be very sort of herky-jerky and not very smooth at all. So the cerebellum is extremely important. Now, with these pieces labeled, we've now completed the reptilian brain, and so the next few areas that we look at are really going to be this crossover to the mammalian brain. And the most important part of the mammalian brain to consider is the limbic system. So there are going to be three pieces that make up the limbic system. And as a group, they are bordering the brain's older parts and the cerebral hemispheres. So they essentially do a lot of special functions that are unique to mammals. And so let's take a look at those three structures now. The first part of the limbic system that we're going to discuss is the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is hard to diagram. You can see it's labeled down here in the lower left of the three-dimensional slide, or the three-dimensional diagram. You can see it's hard to demonstrate where the hippocampus is located on the cross-section, because really there's almost two arms of the hippocampus that come down along the sides of the thalamus. And so as a result, it can get really difficult to kind of see how these two arms are being diagrammed. But essentially, well, I'm not doing a great job here. Hard to color inside the lines on this one. But essentially you can see it comes down on one side and then the other, and there's a little bit of a wraparound that goes up to over the top of the thalamus. The hippocampus is a really easy trick for remembering the function of the hippocampus. The little saying they say is, if there was a hippo on campus, you would remember it. So the hippocampus is the memory indexing center of the brain. It's not necessarily where memories are stored. It's an index, so it's what's activated to then go out and find the various memory pathways throughout our brain and then bring them back into consciousness so that we can actually think about them. It was the hippocampus that was heavily damaged for our boy Clive Waring and that case study that we talked about in the past unit. Right, so really interesting now. Mammals, for the first time in the evolution of the brain, will now have this much greater capacity for memory, and this is really a game changer for mammals compared to reptiles. The second part of the limbic system is the amygdala. And so I described the hippocampus as sort of two arms that are reaching out to different sides of the brain. The amygdala is sort of the fists. They are small little appendages that sit right at the front of the hippocampus. One on this arm and one on this arm here. And actually making them red. I hope your diagrams, your brains are a little prettier than mine, but I think you get the general sense of where these are located. They're again at the very end of the hippocampus arms. The easy way to remember the amygdala, although it's a little goofy, is Amy and Gedalia. Oh, I spelled that wrong. Gedalia. Oops, sorry, there's no extra A in there. I'll fix that afterwards. It's G-D-A-L-A. You got to bring Amy to the Gedalia, or she'll be very angry with you. She'll be very upset that you didn't take her. Now, students always ask me, well, what's a Gedalia? And I say, I don't know. It's some sort of big formal dance that you're supposed to take her to, or it's some club that she wants to go to. I don't know what it is. But the point is that this is the center of, or this is the part of the brain where our most basic emotions, rage and anger, are located from. And it's interesting from an evolutionary perspective that they would be directly connected to the memory centers of the brain, or the memory index of the brain, the hippocampus. So ponder that thought. Why would the amygdala, this anger and rage, these primal emotions, and the hippocampus with memory be so closely linked from an evolutionary perspective, from a survival of the fittest sort of perspective? Because, of course, this feature does continue to survive and is passed on all the way down through mammals to humans. So we'll revisit that piece in class when we follow up to our diagrams. All right, so it's just about time to look at the third part of the limbic system. So the hypothalamus, hypo means, of course, below, is going to be located just below the thalamus, which is the green egg in the center of our brain, our central station, relaying information from neurons all over the brain and the body. So we can label that just really sort of in this sort of triangular region. I'm not doing a very good job making a triangle. Just below the thalamus. It's just kind of this bottom area. Here I'm just going to, on the three-dimensional one, I'm just going to sort of make a little line there across the bottom so you can see about where it's located. Again, we're not doing brain surgery here, we're just getting it close. But the hypothalamus, really important, controls basic maintenance and function. So our basic drives come here, survival drives, eating, drinking. Our sex drive is linked here. The endocrine system, which is made up, of course, of hormones and glands and hormones, are going to be located here. So the hypothalamus is also linked with emotion and reward centers of the brain. If we were to think about this from a Freudian perspective, and we think of the three-part divisions of the mind between the id, the ego, and the superego, it's really in the hypothalamus that we would say that id, pleasure-seeking center, is located. So with these three structures, the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the hypothalamus, the limbic system is really showing a great change in ability of the brain from the previous basic functions of the reptilian brain. So for example, a mammal and people, because they have a hypothalamus that is able to regulate our internal temperature, if we get cold, the hypothalamus and other internal mechanisms can cause us to start to shiver and shake. And of course we shiver so that we can create some muscle movement and generate some heat, and that'll eventually warm us up. For reptiles who don't have a limbic system and thus don't have a hypothalamus, they're cold-blooded. If they need to warm up, they're going to have to actually go and sunbathe, go find a warmer location to have their bodies increase heat. So you can see that this is going to create for mammals much greater ability to function within the environment and to not be so much at the will of the environment. Okay, so now we're really getting somewhere. Now it's time to begin to move on to the highest regions of the brain. Before we do that, I did mention that the hypothalamus has this ability to control the endocrine system. And so before we move on, we should really talk about that just for a moment. The hypothalamus is directly connected to one of the smallest glands in the body, a small gland, but important gland. The pituitary gland, sometimes referred to as the master gland, actually releases hormones after getting messages from the hypothalamus to other glands that then secrete those hormones. And we'll discuss this much more in class, but the hypothalamus pituitary axis, as it's sometimes called, is extremely important. So as you can see on the cross section here, the pituitary gland is this little punching bag kind of guy that hangs just below the hypothalamus, and I'll draw it again on the the three-dimensional diagram as well. Yeah, my diagram is kind of messy, but again, I'm hoping yours is a little bit more precise at home.